Hello everyone, Eric Champagne here for a new chapter of the Public Governance Diaries. The Center on Governance is managing and hosting one of the Fulbright Canada Research Chair in Governance and Public Administration. Through that program, American researchers can spend 4 months on our campus to conduct their research, providing public lectures and mentoring students. If you are watching this video and if you qualify for this program, please visit our website to find out how to apply it as a Fulbright Chair at the University of Ottawa. In the fall of 2022, we had the great pleasure of welcoming Professor Maria Veronica Elias. Veronica is an assistant professor of public administration at the University of Texas, San Antonio. During her Fulbright, she was interested in border management in Canada during COVID-19 by using a narrative research methodology. Through her research, she is observing how the pandemic created a complex challenge between border security, public health, and human rights. During the interview, she is recounting how border controls in times of crisis have a significant impact on migration, especially with refugees. I would like to invite you to watch the entire interview I did with Veronica. And please stay in touch for more episodes of the Public Governance Diaries by following us on our social media. Thanks for listening and see you soon. Veronica, welcome to the Public Governance Diaries.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, today I would like to get your take on Canadian border management during COVID-19, and I would like to focus more with you on the stories, like in the US, that triggered some passionate debates on border management during the crisis. So let me start with a very general and contextual question. To give us the big picture, can you describe the specific challenges for immigration and migrants' mobility during the context of the COVID-19 crisis, and can you address the combination of public health concerns and lockdowns, border security issues, and immigration policies?
Sure. Well, with the COVID-19 pandemic, all countries around the world had to make really tough decisions that really implied public health concerns, border security and safety, as well as human rights issues. And the overall decision for all countries really was to really close borders pretty much, overnight, which led into people not being able to move around as they would have otherwise done. And this created a mobility crisis. And some people talk about, a public health crisis turning into a mobility crisis. Mm-hmm. The intersection here with human rights concerns, which is something that interests me the most, is that what happens when we have a public health crisis at the same time as we have a mobility crisis, where we have refugees and asylum seekers who cannot necessarily be stopped from running away or escaping torture or, persecution in their countries of origin. So the main question here has been, we have to close down borders, but these closures have had unequal burdens or have presented unequal burdens on different groups, in particular migrant groups, and even more so those who are already in vulnerable situations, such as those who are undocumented or are stateless for the reasons of being persecuted and running away from their countries.
Yeah, I see. And from that context, taking in consideration all that context, and looking at your research and observations on Canada, can you describe for us how the public policy narratives about managing borders has changed during the pandemic, and can you give us some concrete examples?
Sure. Well, Canada closed its borders in March 2020 to all migrants, including families and temporary workers, and certainly those who were, certainly refugees and asylum seekers. But the Canadian government made a few exceptions to allow for people who were temporary foreign workers providing services to public health and the agribusiness or agricultural workers. Because of necessity, and the country needed to keep on running. And so in terms of narratives, what really surfaced in my research is that there has been a highlight or a more of a of allowing people who presented less of a risk to the country in terms of what the country needed at the time, and the idea of deservingness and underservedness became crucial. And so the idea that temporary foreign workers in the agricultural sector were still being allowed was a response to the fact that Canada needed, obviously, to continue their food supplies and not cut their food chain from production to distribution, and the same thing with public health workers. And so there is an aspect of usefulness that is attached to the narrative of some specific migrants being allowed during this time of almost absolute border closure, especially within the first year or 10 months to 12 months into the pandemic, when things were still very haphazard, and the governments were trying to figure out how measures were impacting the disease curve. And so I think it's clearly the differential border closures that emerged as a result of economic need and public health need, and maintaining a balance with how much risk we can take in terms of public health, implied created a hierarchy of immigrants, right? Some immigrants really being needed and desired, and others not so much. And among those, obviously, fell the refugees and asylum seekers, undocumented migrants who are fleeing persecution. So they didn't even fare very well in the narratives. They weren't even mentioned. They were more or less a sort of an afterthought. I think in a moment of crisis, as the Covid-19 pandemic, governments really turned into how can we keep our countries functioning in a more or less healthy way, and keep providing for those inside our country. And so I think that really affected negatively those vulnerable groups, and in terms of their access to rights, and also in terms of safety concerns and safety risks. And even those temporary foreign workers were deemed, who were very invisible before the pandemic, became sort of, for Canadians, they recognized that these people play a fundamental role in our society. And so they gain notoriety in many ways, and a very sort of positive narrative attached to it. Now, on the other hand, for instance, refugee advocates were very concerned about the response of the government as basically no response, and not allowing people to come in under any refugee, under the refugee stipulations. And so obviously there are concerns in terms of what happens to these people who basically don't have rights, anywhere pretty much, and except for the country they're running away from, perhaps. And so it's a difficult question, but I think governments sort of did what they thought was sort of most necessary at the time. Obviously, we can always learn from those experiences.
Yeah, thank you, Veronica. I think your observations are really instructive.
Thank you.
Now let's dig down a little bit on the subject. So what's your take on how a public health crisis can affect borders restrictions, and our human rights responsibilities vis-a-vis migrants and vulnerable groups in particular? And what can we do about it, actually?
Yes, and that's a great question. And I think these border closures and public health crisis present challenges that are usually not very much, you cannot envision them very much, especially with pandemics such as the one we are still coming out of. And the fact that some groups are going to be burdened definitely more than others. I mean, in general, everybody had to make sacrifices, and you couldn't travel and whatnot. But really talking and thinking about those who have less rights and are most vulnerable. What happens to these people? And I think what governments can learn from this is that you can, in a way, you cannot stop or suspend providing providing for the needs of those who are really running away from horrendous circumstances. And so you cannot suspend access to rights, basic human rights for these people. How do you allow for, how do you manage a consensus at the political level? It's a very worthwhile question. But I think that these vulnerable groups should not be an afterthought, and they should be included in all this disaster management programs and thinking ahead. In the light of external shocks, what do we do with these mobile populations that are in just great need? I mean, do you have them stop at the border and on the other side, or not allow them in? Are there any more humane ways to talk about these issues and to treat these specific groups of migrants? And I think one of the issues, going back to the question of narratives, is that I think what was expected was that during a time of world crisis, these vulnerable groups, these refugees and asylum seekers, would be seen perhaps under a more humane lens and under with a bit of more of an inclusive narrative. But instead, what the findings show is that immigrants still are very much considered for their economic value, which is not necessarily in itself a bad thing, but I think we need to pay attention more to the human rights and how to uphold our allegiance to international covenants on human rights, like the United Nations Declaration for Human Rights. How can we bring this into preparing for a future pandemic or crisis? Is something that should be front and center, is human rights issues at front and center of government discussions.
Right, this is fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing your thought on this. Finally, I'd like to ask you what you've learned from your most recent research at the University of Ottawa, and what are the next steps in your research projects?
Well, I really, this research subject is just very interesting to me. I have been studying the U.S.-Mexico border before, and now studying how Canada manages its borders. It's brought a new light into the issue. I've learned basically that in many ways, migrants, specifically these undocumented migrants, are their entrance is still contingent. It's not assured. It's not. It's always going to be an issue of usefulness in a way, It seems to me that this pandemic taught us that people whose rights should not be denied up front are suspended. And so that was one issue. And I've seen this obviously in the US-Mexico border research and also in the European countries. But I think with this research, what I'm looking to do is to compare how the US has managed its borders during COVID-19 and compare it with what Canada has done. So far, everything shows that Canada was swift into making the borders more flexible, faster, I guess, than the U.S. in terms of, allowing refugees after, 10 to 12 months actually to return. And we are seeing that in the U.S. that didn't go very well. I mean, that people still were stuck on the other side of the border under very sort of dangerous situations. So Canada presents us a counterpoint to that, and I'm looking forward into investigating this issue further, especially in terms of human rights.
Hey, Veronica, thank you so much for this interview. It was such a pleasure and a privilege to host you at the Center on Governance for the past few months.
It's been a pleasure to be here with you, all of you guys at the Center on Governance at the University of Ottawa. It's been a great experience to be a Fulbright Research Chair 2022-2023 here. Thank you.